Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of Allure of the Poor, sponsored by Drisita Wines. I am your host, Lori, and I am here with another Merlot Me episode. And, those of you who've listened to the first podcast, I do love me my Merlot. And today we have Steve McIntyre from McIntyre Vineyards here to talk about Merlot and, just what is so special about it. So, hi, Steve.
Hello. Hi. How are you doing, Lori?
I am good. So before we get into the whole Merlot me and all of that, I'm going to ask, my first question usually is always the origin story. So how did you come to wine? Or I really should say, I should ask it the other way, is how did wine find you?
Well, my dad was doing some work down in Temecula when they were first planting that area down in the 70s. And he was working with Vince Petrucci at Fresno State and
Go Bulldogs.
And Christian Brothers. And so at any rate, I was into, like a lot of young adults, partying and having a great time. And he said, you like wine so much, you ought to go to school and become a winemaker. Well, I thought he was kidding, I had no idea what that was all about, even though we were an ag family. We grew avocados and citrus, but I ended up at Fresno State and got my master's in enology and an undergraduate degree in viticulture, worked for Vince Petrucci for a while, and the rest is history. I just fell in love with wine.
And when you what was your first vintage of your own? Like you made your first wine that you were responsible for it. How nerve-wracking was that?
It was 1982, and it was out in Cachagua. I was planting Galante vineyards. That was my first job out of college before I went to Hahn Smith & Hook. And so we were making that area out there is called Cachagua in Upper Carmel Valley. So we were making Cachagua shed wine prior to producing Galante vineyards. And we got those grapes from Durney, which was back in the day a nice cab Merlot vineyard, and made it out in the shed. Yeah, you're right. Nerve-wracking is a good way to put it. So you get used to it, right? I mean, whether it's having children or what have you, anything that involves strong emotion, eventually you normalize those things and you learn to live with everything.
Right, absolutely. Did you like sleep with the wine? Like I think back to like our first vintage, it was like, I'm still kind of a nervous wreck every vintage, but like, that first vintage, it's like you don't want to leave it because something could go wrong if you walk away.
Yeah, that's very true. And in fact, nowadays, having been in the business long enough, I think of ourselves as glorified babysitters. In fact, so if you're a really good babysitter and you have a pool at the house and you turn your back, you almost have that sixth sense that the child's going to fall in, and you turn around and rescue them. And I think that's kind of the way winemaking gets at a certain point, where you just kind of have that sixth sense that says, maybe I better intervene, otherwise I'm going to leave it alone.
Right. And I think that like, as you pull it in from the vineyard itself, you kind of in your brain already have the process of, all right, this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen. This is what could happen. So I'm going to pay attention to this and things like that. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. Experience.
And yes. And so that first vintage, you were dealing with Merlot from back then.
Yes, I was. I had some Merlot and Cabernet. So in fact, when I went out to Hahn Smith & Hook, back in that day, that was 1983, they were producing, there wasn't any Pinot Noir around. It was all Cabernet, a little bit of Cab Franc, and Merlot. And we struggled. The 79 vintage had some acclaim. The 81 vintage had some acclaim. But because of how cool it was, and with our wind, the university hadn't factored in how much wind we got, which limited photosynthesis. And it was some years we had vegetal issues, we had those bell peppers. And so when things changed and Hahn became Pinot Noir centric and that whole San Lucia Highlands, there isn't any Cabernet up there to speak of. Merlot became a chip on my shoulder, that I wanted to be able to make Merlot consistently that didn't have that vegetal component, and be able to show that, it's possible in Monterey County. So that's how I kept up, my love for Merlot.
So before I have questions about that Monterey environment, and how that affects Merlot, because Merlot can be a little finicky.
Yeah.
But so before we get into that, let's talk about tell us about Monterey County itself. Like, for people who, there are people that are out of the country, there's people who are on the wrong coast. Where exactly is Monterey County? And then, like, what is the climate like? What soils do you typically see in Monterey County?
Yeah, so Monterey County is 120 miles more or less south of San Francisco. And it is best known for the aquarium and Carmel and the Monterey Bay Sanctuary, which truly is an amazing, ocean area. And then inland of that, you have the Salinas Valley, which of course is well known as the salad bowl of the United States. And that's 250,000 irrigated acres of agriculture. So the beautiful thing is it's not a monoculture. The grapes are the fourth, I think we were number 4 on the list of 25 or 30 crops last year in terms of value in acres, strawberries being number 1. So unlike a lot of growing areas, we're very diverse, but we have a very strong agricultural infrastructure. And we don't have a lot of urban interface, so there's not a lot of problems with that in terms of farming. But what we're really well known for, or infamously known for, is our wind. It starts at like clockwork between May and September at 1 p.m. every afternoon. And it blows. It's not one of these winds like I grew up with in Ventura, where it blows from 1 to 5 and then sunset comes and it diminishes. It blows almost all night long.
Wow.
Yeah, and that has the most impact. I like to call it part of our terroir. And for me, terroir is everything you can't change. And that has the most impact on grapes far and wide throughout the entire valley until you get down to Paso Robles, where you don't have any wind. So it shuts the vine down. It limits its photosynthetic activity because the wind velocity is so strong. And so that gives us a longer hang time than most other growing regions. And as a result, sugar accumulation is slowed down because the photosynthetic activity of the vine is diminished. But it gives time for all the other things that we're trying to download into the grape, for structure and aromatics and flavor to accumulate. And so that's why we end up with wines that are Pinot Noirs, and for reference, that are quite almost masculine. We get accused of adding Syrah, but for Bordeaux varietals, it's really a curse because you need that photosynthetic activity and to allow the pyrazines to diminish over time. Every Cabernet vineyard, Merlot vineyard has pyrazines at 19 Brix or 18 Brix, but they disappear in the warmer climates with warmer evenings and such, and less of a maritime impact. And so that's why it was so difficult to grow the Bordeaux varietals as opposed to where we are now with Pinot Noir.
Now the wind can be beneficial in terms, because Monterey, you guys get a lot of fog also, right?
Right, exactly.
So fog can be detrimental to grapes because now you're worried about the mildew, the mold, that type of thing. But the wind actually then dries off the grapes.
That's right.
To allow you to stay on longer. You're not worried about that aspect either.
Yeah, we actually like to say if we get an inch of rain, we'll get an inch of wind and dry things out. So it does have that benefit, yes.
And now, what soil do you look for in a vineyard that you're going to use for the McIntyre Merlot?
I would look for a granitic-based soil, an alluvial soil that's washed out of the mountains with some elevation rather than being right down on the valley floor, because the wind we have here is what I like to call a ground effect wind. So the narrower the Salinas Valley and the lower the elevation, right down there at the river level, the stronger the wind. As you get up on the sides of the valley, the wind diminishes. In fact, if you're up at Chalon, which is right across from Hahn, there's no wind to speak of. Or it could be the opposite direction. In fact, you'll find out in an aircraft taking off from Salinas, it can be blowing 20 knots on the ground, but you get up at 1,800 feet of altitude and it's gone. So getting up on those side benches with the granitic soils of fairly low fertility, so you don't get an excess amount of vigor, is really where you want to be.
And that actually, my next question, Merlot, in terms of vigor, how difficulty, so people who are listening, when a vine, you need it to be in balance between its green, which is its vegetative state, and its reproductive state, which is the berries. So in terms of this vigor, how difficult is it to keep a Merlot vine in balance? Does it like to go green?
Yeah, it does. In fact, one of the problems with Merlot is its prostrate nature. It wants to fall out of trellis systems, as opposed to Cabernet or Cab Franc, which is very upright and prostrate. So you really got to do a lot of canopy management to keep it in a VSP. It tends to be, that was part of the problem with producing Bordeaux varietals back in the 80s. We were overwatering them. So a lot of wineries came in and allowed us as growers to almost dryland farm in a very, as you know, you're in pastoralists, we don't get a lot of rain. And that was one extreme. And so that's too far. So then we graduated, I guess you could say, to where we only irrigate when it gets hot. And so if it's over 95 or something, and we're watching our moisture, soil moisture levels really closely, we'll give them some water. But so allow it about 3 weeks before veraison, we want those roots to be dry enough that they start to signal hormonally the leaves to, hey, wait a minute, we're running out of water here. The shoot tips slow down and stop growing, and the vine starts to concentrate on its progeny, the seeds, the fruit, rather than leaf and shoot growth.
Well, so you're thinking you're 3 weeks ahead of veraison. You're like praying no rain, you're praying.
Right. We want to shut those vines down and make them think they're under stress so that they concentrate on what's important to us.
There's so much science to it that I mean, it's my happy place, so I love it, but I love, that's a new tidbit to me for Merlot. Like that's
Sure.
a new tidbit for me to, that's fantastic. Now McIntyre actually farms like 12,000 acres in the Santa Lucia Highlands, Arroyo Seco, San Bernabé, and Hames Valley.
Yeah, and
I've never even
actually
heard.
Down in Paso as well.
Oh, okay. So we'll save Paso for a second. We'll keep them by themselves, and we'll talk to that itself. But so how far apart are these regions? Is it easy? Like, are you going from one region to the next, easily, or are they quite a distance away from each other?
There's quite a distance between Hames Valley on the southern end and the Santa Lucia Highlands on the northern end. There's about 50 miles. Okay. So, but everything else is in between. So it works out pretty well. We put a lot of miles on our trucks, and we try and go downwind as much as possible. But it's spread out quite a ways.
And do you have Merlot in each of those regions?
No.
Okay.
The Santa Lucia Highlands Merlot is too cool, and there's too much wind. Where we're growing it for this particular bottle that you'll be tasting is Arroyo Seco, and we're up against the hill, less wind. We're around the bend, so to speak, where the Arroyo Seco River enters the Salinas Valley. And because of that, we get some heat coming down that river channel. So this vineyard, Kimberly Vineyard, named after my wife, it was a anniversary gift that didn't cost me anything. And that heat comes through there, a little less wind, and you're able to get Merlot ripe in that northern most boundary.
And are what direction are they facing north also? Are the vines planted
The
to be north?
slope faces north. Yes, it
Yes.
does. Right.
Okay. And because that's going to help with the environment that the Merlot likes to,
Yeah.
right, keep
Right.
it a little bit cooler.
Mhm.
Okay, so now let's go to Paso. Where are you in Paso?
Well, Paso Robles, we're out in Shandon. We're also on, remember the old Arciero property?
Arciero. I need a
Yeah,
little bit
on
of
Highway 46, the winery it's now, I forget what they call it now, but Dry Creek Vineyard is right there. That's the one we farm. We're also in Creston at Windfall.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So those are the 3 vineyards we farm in Paso.
And what are you growing there?
Oh, all the Bordeaux varietals plus Petite Syrahs, some Primitivo, Grenache Noir, Grenache Blanc, and I think, that's about, Mourvedre, yeah.
Oh, of course. Okay. Mourvedre. Oh, yeah. All right. So back to Merlot. Sorry. My husband says I'm like the one of my favorite movies is Up, and the dog that's like squirrel, and he goes running off. My husband thinks that's me all the time, and it probably is true. I get sidebar very easily. So we are here to celebrate Merlot Me. And so what do you think Merlot Me is really about? Like, what is the heart, soul of Merlot Me?
I think that for me, Merlot is more, I like to think of it as something different than Cabernet. I think a lot of people produce Merlots that are almost indistinguishable from Cabernet. But cooler climate like Arroyo Seco, we're getting some components that are much more fruit forward. One of my inspirations early on with Merlot was Swanson and Trichard, in the Carneros area up north. Again, cooler climate sites for Bordeaux varietals. And you really have to be careful you don't overcrop them, overwater, to keep them from going vegetal on you. But I think the reward can be quite significant. And then, a standalone Merlot, which you don't see very many of it any longer, at least in this country, that cedar, cassis type of fruit component, that's kind of what I'm looking for. And we are minimalists by nature in our winemaking. So we're not leaving the Merlot in oak as long as maybe some others. We're treating it, with a macerated fermentation, put some punch downs up front, a cold soak, so we're treating it almost like Pinot Noir. And so we're getting we're a different style than maybe you might see, like I said, if you're making Cabernet or something.
I think well, first of all, thank you, because that was a perfect segue to allow me to take a sip. So what I have in my glass is the 2016 McIntyre Kimberly Vineyard, and it is 100% Merlot.
It is, yeah.
From Arroyo Seco. And the first thing that pops out to me is cedar. Like, I get a beautiful cedar, and it's like when you open up like an old, if anybody still has them, because my mom does, like the Hope chest.
Right.
Open it and it's all cedar. It's a happy place for me.
Yeah.
Cedar. And then it is darker fruit.
It is.
So darker fruit. And now that, if you can explain that a little bit as to why you're getting the darker fruit versus the red fruit that some other Merlots may show, what's causing that?
Yeah, I think that that is just extremely long, and I don't like the word hang time, but because of our climate, the length of time that grape is out there from from bloom on to harvest, so you accumulate a lot of structure that, from a phenolic and tannin standpoint, provide that juicy tannin type of fruit that tends to be darker than the red bright fruit that you would get with a little less tannin structure. So that's kind of how I would portray it.
The acid backbone is beautiful.
Thank you.
Right on the tip of the tongue. It's beautiful. And then the flavors, it's like a nice dark plum, and it actually has a little bit of chocolateness to it. That is nice.
Yeah.
And a little on the palate, on the finish, there's I'm always bad with my spices.
Oh.
I'm bad with my spices, but like a little bit of a brown, you know, a little spice that gives it an additional, like when you think it's over, when you think it's over, you get this additional, you know, like a it's not cinnamon. I don't know. I want to say cardamom, but I'm not really sure what cardamom tastes like. So
I wouldn't either.
But it's in that kind of family thing, but it's beautiful. The plum and the dark fruit with just the hint of spice and everything, and it's beautiful. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Laurie, thank you.
And now what so let's talk about the 2016 vintage.
Right.
And this is I hate when people ask this, but I'm going to ask it. Easy vintage, difficult vintage?
As I recall, because 17 was the last time we had 116 degrees in the vineyard for 2 days on Labor Day 2017, which was otherwise almost a perfect vintage, you know, weather-wise. And the vines turned out actually quite well. So that vintage, from my memory standpoint, is so significant because I was freaking out at those temperatures that 16 must have been easier, you know. But as I recall, 16 wasn't quite as consistent. A little cooler in the spring, so not quite as outstanding of a weather year. So we had more hens and chicks and in the clusters. And I did send you the 17 too. You might try. The reason we sent 2 vintages is because of the different. One was cooler, 16 was cooler, 17 was warmer.
Oh, okay. I can open it. I have no problem opening a second bottle. But so now let's go back to the winds that you have in your area, because Merlot has a somewhat long flowering period. Okay. So the winds can be really, really, you mentioned the hens and chicks or jacks or shatter, you know, does the wind, are you a you know, are you nervous during that time when they're flowering, if this wind is coming in so consistently?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the fact that we know it's coming, you have to anticipate that there's going to be fog with it. Generally speaking, the windier a day might be, the more fog you're going to have because you have an onshore flow.
Okay.
So when we have a high pressure come through and we have nice weather, the wind is maybe only 10, 12 knots as opposed to 20 knots. So when it starts to get 20 knots and you have a lot of fog coming in, then your average daytime temperatures might only be 68 or 70. And that really has a negative impact on berry set in Merlot. No doubt about it. So those years with the cool springs, you know, we know we're going to have a diminished amount of crop. We know we're going to have the shot berries, and we just have to live with that. But the good news is, in this case, we're not concerned about yield. In fact, we're not going to have to thin as much as we might otherwise have to thin if all the berries set and we have a very tight cluster. So, you know, we kind of freak out. We don't, you know, we're not going to get as good a set, and we're going to have all of these shot berries. But on the other hand, we know we won't have to thin it, and the crop size will be adequate. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, do you ever whole cluster Merlot?
Well, that's not necessarily whole cluster, but that cold soak. There's probably whole clusters in there, because we really are just destemming, so the smaller clusters might get through. So there could be some, but the cold soak, I think, is something that we really like, the impacts of that on this particular vineyard, at least. Mm-hmm.
And can you just explain cold
Oh,
soak
cold soak?
for people who might
Sure.
not?
For about 4 or 5 days, we're letting the grapes, after we destem them, we're letting them sit there in whatever juice they might have. Merlot doesn't juice very much. So it's tricky because you don't want to get a lot of volatile acidity going, with Acetobacter or lactobacillus bacteria. So you have to be really careful about adding a lot of dry ice and very lightly punching the cap down or the grapes down to keep them wet with juice, and keep that dry ice on top of the bin or the tank, the small tanks, because these are made in about 1.5 ton fermenters, or up to 3-ton fermenters. Keeping that CO2 on blanket on top of those grapes and keeping them in that 55 to 56 degree temperature range Fahrenheit. So that you don't get VA building up. And then you pitch some yeast. In our case, we generally don't pitch yeast. We just let them warm up and the natural yeast start to take over. And if they don't, we might pitch some yeast. But generally speaking, we have a pretty hearty and healthy fermentation going at like day 6 or 7.
Oh, okay. So that's awesome. And I'm seeing more of that. Makes me nervous. We're not big enough. Like if we lose a barrel, like that's a big deal, that's a little nerve-wracking. But I love the idea where you're allowing the healthy yeast that are on there to just go. Now, do you think that they are native yeast are as efficient or more? No. Okay.
They're generally not, and a lot of the research bears that out, but because they're not, before Cerevisiae comes in and takes over, you get more complexity by having a slower start to that fermentation. And, the yeast can clean up a lot of things that have happened prior to fermentation. So I really like the wild yeast. Just let them go and let Cerevisiae finish and take over.
Do you think that leads to a lower overall alcohol too? Are you shooting for lower alcohol, or?
We'd like to be able to control that, but we really haven't figured that out. Certainly there are yeast strains that would produce less alcohol, but nothing that really excites me. So we just kind of let alcohol happen, unfortunately. I've seen the pendulums shift in all the grapes we grow from, 26 bricks back down to 24. And I think we're seeing wines age better as a result of a little lower alcohol and picking them at a more moderate bricks level. Of course, we're not all about bricks, but at least that's one indicator you can utilize.
And earlier you were talking about the pyrazines in the Merlot and, Cab Franc, Cab Sauv, that whole family, because it is the same family, is pyrazine, it's in there. And you had said that at 19, it has the pyrazines. At what time do you start to see those pyrazines generally breaking down?
They, if you look at the literature, they're fairly high concentration right at veraison, so like 14 bricks, and they have a very steady decline, and then they tail off below the threshold at which most humans can taste them. And that tends to coincide with the seeds turning brown,
Okay.
Yeah.
All Right. So your vineyard is kind of right. You had mentioned that it's right along the Santa Lucia Mountains, like
Yeah,
in that northern thing. So,
right,
we talk about, you said that you believe terroir is the things that you can't change. Well,
right,
we definitely can't change the Santa Lucia Mountains.
right.
So what impact does that mountain range play on your Merlot?
And they're huge. That would be the second most significant impact. And primarily because the Big Sur coast, we're only, as the crow flies, maybe 10 miles from the ocean, but boy, that's a rough 10 miles with mountains. So in Big Sur, you have the highest topographical altitude change in the shortest distance of anywhere other than Patagonia and Alaska. In other words, you'd be on the beach at the ocean, you look up and there's some pretty close to you are some 5,000-foot mountains. As a result of that, all our storms here come in counterclockwise and they hit that, and you have that onographic lift. And as a result of that lift, those clouds are now saturated as they rise in altitude. And all the rain falls in Big Sur. They get 50 inches of rain on average. By the time it gets over to the end of the mountains where our vineyards sit along the San Lucia Highlands and Arroyo Seco, they're pretty much rained out. So we don't get rain. Generally speaking, in the 36 years I've been doing this, we might get a half an inch of rain at harvest. That's it, and maybe one storm. And so we don't have like Oregon where, or Washington where it's raining once a week. And so we have more control over our irrigation regimes than you do in Europe, where they're relying on, rainfall once every couple of weeks or once a month or not at all, or Washington and Oregon. And so that control, it's even more than the Russian River area or Alexander Valley, Stag's Leap, where they're relying on high amount of rainfall and groundwater, and they're not so much utilizing, irrigation. So that I'd rather have that control than, have it rain when I don't need it to. And so I think those mountains really contribute to a uniform vintage potential, so that we really just have to deal with set and bloom as the biggest variable in terms of our growing conditions.
So they're high enough that you're actually seeing a Foehn effect.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
You're seeing
yeah,
a Foehn
definitely.
effect.
There's a shadow, rain shadow.
Right. Absolutely. That you have to love. It's science, people. It's science.
Yeah, it is.
So I did open, you had to twist my arm real hard. I did open the 2017 Kimberly Vineyard McIntyre Merlot, and it is a completely different wine.
Yeah.
It is a completely different wine. It is actually more of a redder, brighter.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Brighter.
Red fruit.
Yes. And that cedar is not as predominant in this wine as it is in the 16.
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah, again, that 17 vintage was it was absolutely perfect until it wasn't, and 116, I'm sure, it denatured some of those nice C6 carbon compounds that would have otherwise gone into, a great tannin or aromatic type of thing.
It's a lighter bodied.
Yeah,
it's a lighter bodied.
Exactly.
So that's a great question. So in terms of Merlot, ageability of Merlot.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you find your sweet spot for? I mean, this is a 2016 and 2017. They're drinking beautifully, but where do you see them going? And vintage by vintage, we can change that, but like general.
Right. Well, we've been producing Merlot off this vineyard since 2005. And when we go back, we're actually quite pleased with what we're seeing. However, I'd like to temper the alcohols a bit like we talked about. I mean, if you look at the great Bordeaux's, and how well many of them have aged. If you ask a lot of the winemakers from France, their opinion, they believe that the wines age better at 14 or 13.9, 13.8, something like that, rather than 14.6 or higher. And I tend to believe that. So that's one of the reasons the pendulum has shifted back from 26, 27 bricks back and watering things down and adding a lot of acid to maybe 24, 25. And I think the wines age better. And that's been our experience. But we have, as I mentioned, we generally don't release the Merlot. The 17 is the current vintage until we have at least 5 years, so that they're much more drinkable and approachable for people.
So what's your philosophy of that? You're keeping it in barrel for the 5 years and then bottling, or you're barreling for how long, aging for how long?
Yeah, minimalistically winemaking, we're barreling for 18 months.
Okay.
And then we're going into the bottle and we're letting it age in the bottle before release. So we like it on Merlot, we like at least a couple of years of age in the bottle.
Okay. And how do you see Merlot? We talk about some wines love oak, they like soak it all in, and others like almost are fighting it, repeating it. Where does Merlot fall into that realm? Because I in neither of them, I don't get, and this is a big positive for me, there's not an oak influence, like, I'm not saying, oh, well, this is, this is a Napa Cab,
Right. Yes, you're absolutely right, Lori. And I'm the same way. So for our winemaking, we would rather and this is from Professor Vince Petrucci, let the grape speak for itself. That goes with our Pinots, our Chardonnays. So what we like about oak is the micro-oxygenation that takes place and the dehydration, or evaporation rather, not dehydration, that concentrates things. But for Merlot as a grape, I think you could go to either extreme. You could go to American oak type, or you can do what we're doing. And I think so we fall in the extreme of less in that particular case.
And your oak is French, neutral?
It is. Yeah, it's French oak, and generally about 40% of it's new each year. So a fair amount of neutral barrels, again, because we want that oxygen to soften the wine.
And multiple cooperages, or do you have a favorite cooperage?
No, it seems like we're experimenting. Our chief winemaker, Byron Kasugi, up in Napa, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention him. We tend to do, he does all the heavy lifting, but we tend to make wine by committee. We have a number of winemakers that we're working with. In fact, in our Pinot Noir now, we have a winemaker series where we let winemakers go into the vineyard and do what they want to do, not what we want to do. And then we all get together and compare those blind, and it accelerates the pace of discovery in vineyard, basically. But so there's just so much collaboration. It's like songwriting, I think it's nowadays, I forget which artist I saw that had like 30 people, collaborating on one song. That may be an extreme, but I do think more than one mind is more of a creative process. So.
And that is so cool, because like if you think about that, you're taking the same vineyard site and then you're putting different artistic approach onto it. And whether somebody acidifies to this or takes it in, or maybe doesn't cold soak or does cold soak, all of these things are just added data points to allow you to say, well, okay, well, I like this, I don't like that, but this and that come together to come out to be pretty cool. So
yeah, that's how you can accelerate learning about your vineyard and your site.
That is fantastic. I love that.
Thank you.
Now, so here's the thing: we can't talk about Merlot me, and it's always the elephant in the room type thing. But we have to talk about it. Is that wonderful movie Sideways?
Yeah. Yes.
So, how do you feel about the movie Sideways and how it impacted Merlot?
Well, it's unfortunate. We planted a lot of Merlot back in 94, 95, and then we've pulled out Merlot ever since. We still, of course, grow Merlot, but it's not the variety that it once was in terms of, but I think that's a trend that's going to find a happy ending. And I'll explain, because from what I understand in Bordeaux, decades ago, Merlot was the predominant, and it had its issues with set. It had its issues with, all kinds of, and so Cab took over. And then, but you still have Petrus, right? And so when people say, oh, Merlot, I always say, well, have you ever had a Petrus, And a lot of
I
folks
wish I
have.
could say yes. I wish I could say yes.
Yeah, well, you should someday. And that will make you a Merlot believer, just that experience alone.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
My big thing with Sideways, and I did say it when I told you, I'm doing a series of these for Merlot Me, but
Yeah.
I said it with Nick Goldschmidt on a previous episode. I think, first of all, the thing that drives me crazy about Sideways is the fact that people remember this one line
Right.
from the movie and completely miss why he's saying the line, right?
Mhm.
He's saying I'm not drinking any effing Merlot. All right. And that was it. Everybody's like, well, I can't drink, now
Yeah.
I'm going to drink Pinot, and I have nothing against Pinot. I'm a big Pinot fan. But the thing is it's his ex-wife's drink.
Mhm.
And that's why he's not drinking it. And then at the end of the movie, what is he drinking? Right. Right. So the thing about the movie that drives me crazy is it kind of says a little bit about our society that I wish was not true, about how easily people are like,
led down the road. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's horrible. And then the other thing, in my opinion, and then you can tell me how you think about it. The other thing that I say about Merlot, and one of the reasons why we had this effect so vividly of this effect, is that at that point, I don't think many people who were growing Merlot, we were still in the learning phase
Yeah.
of Merlot.
That's right.
And like everything else, when you're learning, you make mistakes.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
it was kind of like a storm of this line and a lot of not understanding Merlot that kind of did this. So that's my opinion. What is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, because back in the 80s, when I was growing Merlot up at Hahn with Cabernet, I mentioned how much we struggled. When you finally are in an area, and we're still relatively new area, winemaking area in Paso and the Central Coast, you finally end up hopefully finding the variety in your site that's a no-brainer. Okay, so that was Pinot up in the Highlands. But elsewhere, if you do your homework, you can start to find sites that have the promise to do particular varieties. And we found this site, Kimberly Vineyard, we thought, did Merlot. Now we're confident enough that we have planted some Cabernet next to it, a cool climate Cabernet. And we did Petit Verdot, we did Malbec. And so we're starting to have the confidence, because of what we have learned, because of our experience, to be able to say, okay, well, maybe we can grow Cab here and we can do it consistently. So that's the goal.
Right? You've got to learn. You've got to learn your environment, right? And that's with anything, not just grape growing, right? You have to learn what works and what doesn't work. And I think the combination of that movie, and I mean, honestly, back then there were a lot of not so great examples of Merlot.
Yeah.
But as I say, there's also not so great examples of Cab. There's also not so, it's across the board of that. And I think that people like you, who are dedicated to the single varietal Merlots, and doing these experimentations that you're doing to advance the understanding of what the soil and what the climate, the terroir, is doing to Merlot, only makes the Merlot phenomenal.
Yeah.
And,
Helps, yeah.
And
It gets better.
yeah, absolutely. And have you seen an increase in excitement for Merlot, or is Merlot still kind of a hard sell?
It's a hard sell still. I mean, to be honest, but the good news is there aren't that many people selling Merlot. So when you do go into a restaurant, especially if you're, a value price product like this is, you will exceed people's expectations much easier than you would if you're trying to sell Pinot or Cabernet right now. So
yeah, I'll give you that. That is true. We were doing a pouring event in Solvang, and all anybody ever wanted was Pinot.
yeah,
And like they would come up, do you have Pinot? No, I don't have Pinot. Do you have Pinot? No, I don't have Pinot. But then when they taste Cab Franc, they're, oh, what is this? Because
yeah,
there's not a lot of Cab Franc out,
exactly.
Absolutely. I think that I feel, but maybe it's because I'm hyper aware of it. I think that there are more Merlots coming out. I think more people are starting to produce it.
Yeah, we can get a buzz going again.
Right, absolutely. And that is really what Merlot Me Month is all about, is trying to get a buzz about it going.
Great.
And so I'm going to ask you, if you have to give 3 things that you wish people knew about Merlot, what would 3 things be?
It makes one of the most expensive wines in the world, Petrus.
And that's how you say it, people, not Petrus.
Yeah. And that it can be grown in a cool climate. The third thing would be, that's a good, I don't know, what would the third one be? Oh gosh, you've stumped me on the third.
I'm gonna let you think about the third one, because we still have one more of your incredible wines to talk about. And so this is the 2016 I'm gonna say it wrong, Perador?
Ardua.
Ardua.
Yeah, it's
that might be because I need my
Gaelic.
glasses on.
Well, and it's Gaelic.
It's Gaelic? Oh, Sláinte.
It means through difficulty in the Gaelic language. And that is the motto of the McIntyre clan. So that's where that came from. And that's our crest.
That's your crest?
Yeah.
That is beautiful.
Yeah.
That is beautiful. Actually, now I'm embarrassed. I didn't know what that was, because
no.
Well, no, because I do Sláinte all the time. I Gaelic all the time. So yes. So tell me about this wine. This is a Merlot based wine.
Right. So there's where we headed when we got the Malbec producing and the Petit Bordeaux producing, and we'll eventually add Cabernet to that. So it represents, there's a little spiel on the back label that talks about how we've struggled, right? And it's a chip on my shoulder to try and make something like this in a cool climate where people said, oh no, you can't grow Cab in Monterey County. So that's what it is. It's that struggle and how we are adapting to that particular challenge.
And this is a 2016. Is this
Correct.
How many vintages of this have you made?
That was the first vintage.
This was the first vintage.
Yeah,
oh, I'm honored. And is your idea behind the wine to always be Merlot dominant, or is it going to be as I call it for our wine, the play wine? Let me see what I can do. How does this go? I
think it'll evolve, and I have no preconceived notion of what variety might become the predominant. And that's what's fun about it, as finding that whatever that blend might be, and it might be different in a given vintage, like you saw the 17 versus 16 Merlot, so I think that by having it be a red table wine, Meritage, if you would, allows us that freedom to explore in a given vintage, to come up by consensus, and committee with something that is the best expression of place from that particular year.
So this is your thought process of this wine is a vintage expression. What is
Correct.
the best of 2016 or what is
Yeah.
the best of
For that site.
2017 for that site?
Right.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. And is this all, so this is also Arroyo Seco.
Yes.
So is this all multiple vineyard? No, this is a single vineyard.
Yeah.
But
That one.
Oh, it is still Kimberly. I
Yeah,
should start wearing
right.
my glasses more. That is
Yeah.
also Kimberly vineyard. So
Yeah.
so you have Merlots. Do you also make individual varietals of the other ones?
No, we don't.
Okay.
Yeah, we didn't want to get that far down the road and be confusing and take away from the Merlot. So we'll always produce the Merlot. And then the Paraguay will be that blend of the different. I mean, I suppose if one of the varieties just stands out, but my experience has been that the blends are most of the time better. So yeah.
It just adds a little. I had this conversation with Nick on the last one of, people who say you can't be complex in a single vineyard, and that is not true.
That's
That
true.
is,
You're right.
that is not true at all. You can be complex in a single vineyard. How you're processing the fruit, when you're picking the fruit, doing one run, two run. There's loads of things you can do to make a complex wine out of a single vineyard. But there is something to be said about adding other varietals into the blend because they each have their own characteristics and but the key is making sure that they marry well together.
Right. That's good. Yeah.
You don't want them fighting with each other in that bottle.
Right. Absolutely.
So do you have any final thoughts on Merlot that you want to share about your Merlot specifically?
I just hope that people will, try Merlot and have a little bit more of a discovery about wine and take some risk with their winemaking or wine drinking and winemaking, and enjoy some of the unusual, if you would. And we got to get out of our ruts, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And if you look at the wine list, sometimes just do this and pick something and find something new. You never know what you're going to love. And I think Merlot has so much to offer for people. It is such a nice wine. It's a wine that I think you can pair throughout the whole meal. You can have a Merlot early on in the courses of the meal. You can have it with the main course.
Right.
It's so variable that I think it has a lot to offer, and more people need to give it a shot again.
Absolutely.
And now, where can people find McIntyre? Social media? What's your website? Can they come taste with you? What?
Yeah, McIntyre Vineyards, we have a tasting studio in Carmel at the Carmel Crossroads Shopping Center. So you can stop in there. Like everybody, we have a wine club online. Our website is McIntyrevineyards.com. And we're building a hospitality center in the San Lucia Highlands. We've finished the first phase, which is a park and structure, and done all of the grading, and it's a beautiful landscaped area now. But next phase will be a tasting room there at the vineyard, our home vineyard, and eventually a winery. But we're taking it slow. You can make wine anywhere, but you need a place to entertain folks and give them that experience.
Right, absolutely. And then if they wanted to come taste with you, they can just do that through your website.
That's right. Yeah. McIntyrevineyards.com.
Okay. And anything else? Social media? You're on Instagram?
Oh yeah,
all everywhere.
Exactly.
Facebook, everywhere.
All the good stuff.
All the good stuff. I will link all of that up. I'll link the website up and the social media up in the show notes. And Steve, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wines. And I'm not gonna lie, I'm glad I opened up that second bottle because it really was a cool experimentation of showing, it's the same vineyard and the same winemaker, the same fruit. It's just a different vintage, and to see how it varies from one vintage to the next was really exceptional. So I actually did save a little bit, even though I got more. I'll raise my little glass to you and I will say slancha and thank you very much. And here's to Merlot me month.
Great. Thank you very much, Lori, for the opportunity.
Thank you.
You bet. See ya.